Mr. President, we come to the end of what I think has been a very productive conference. I'm not happy, as most of us aren't, with an ending that doesn't allow us to get all of the principal work of the Congress done, which is to decide how we're going to fund the government, how we're going to spend money. We did, this year, for the first time in a long time, get 75% of that job done before the beginning of the fiscal year. There's nowhere else in America that would be a bragging point. But we hadn't done that in 20 years, and so it's a pretty significant thing for us to accomplish. What we need to figure out is what we did and how we can replicate that in the future. We have to get to this work. We have to have the kind of floor debates that we had this year, and we don't need to let it drag into the end of the year as too many of the bills did this time. Now, you know, the worst possible thing to do, in my view, in terms of funding the government, is to shut down the government. The next worst possible thing to do is a long-term CR, where you just say, we couldn't decide how to spend the money this year, so we're going to spend it like we spent it last year. And then the next option is the one we're following, which appears to be a short-term CR to unfortunately come back and begin next year's work with the obligation to finish this year's work. That is clearly a mistake, and it's a mistake that ends a Congress that otherwise pretty successful. All kinds of regulatory reform occurred. Some of it the Congress was involved in. For the first time in the history of the Congressional Review Act, the Congress 15 times sent to the President a regulation that the Congress was not going to approve, and 15 times the President agreed with that decision. That happened exactly one other time in the 25-year history of the Congressional Review Act. We had done that one time before this Congress, when it happened 15 times. The regulatory situation in the country is much better. The first major rewrite in the tax bill in 31 years clearly has had and is having an impact on our economy. The numbers in my state, Missouri, are as good as they've been in a long time. I think our unemployment number is the lowest in 18 years. The national unemployment number is the lowest in almost 50 years. And Missouri's number at 3.2% is even lower than that. Things like a long-term FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration extension, the Farm Bill, a lot of things that we should be talking about. I want to talk today for just a few minutes about the things that have happened for Missouri this year here in the Senate. We have made significant progress in addressing some of the most important issues facing both the state and the nation. Just this month, we had a land transfer for the National Geospatial Agency that started out as an ocean mapping agency in St. Louis, Missouri, decades ago, and then became a full partner in our overhead architecture that tries to figure out what's going on in the world at any given moment in any given day. Things like mapping out what we knew about the outside of the place where Osama bin Laden was hiding and was eventually found there, guessing from watching traffic in and out of that what might be on the other side of the door when you went in. That's just one of the things that happens at the National Geospatial Agency every day, and that one and others happen at NGA West, the St. Louis facility. Big competition on what we should do about that. The decision was made to put that $1.3 billion new facility in the city of St. Louis, right next to, Mr. President, one of the great federal disasters of all time, where the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex, not well thought out, had to be imploded within a short time of people moving in there. Within a decade or so, it was known to be a disaster. Not too long after that, just imploded, and that sort of began the implosion of so much of that part of a city that at one time was the fourth biggest city in the country in terms of population. It's not there any longer, but things like the GEOINT workforce, the National Geospatial Location being there will make a difference. Certainly in aviation, we make lots of military aircraft in our state, and the bill that we funded really brought that line of that we'd worried so much about in recent years back to where we have now multi-year funding of things like the Super Hornet, the Hornet, the Growler. Growler was a Growler, dude. It just so totally disrupts the efforts of our enemies to figure out what that formation of planes is all about. It is an important part of flying, whether they come off the deck of a ship or off a runway anywhere else in the world. The Air Force TX trainer, Boeing won the opportunity to make that new trainer and is beginning the process right now. The non-manned tanker, important. Keeping those lines open in a way that we were concerned just a few years ago wouldn't happen. I had the chance this weekend to be part of the launching of the future Freedom-class ship USS St. Louis, where the Navy asked for 32 of those ships, and this Congress gave them 35. Now, if you're listening and you're out there and you're a taxpayer and you're thinking about this, well, why would the Congress give them 35 when they asked for 32? We look not just at the immediate need of that line, but the long-term, the unfunded need. And it hasn't been that long, Mr. President, when if the Navy would have asked for 32 ships, they might have gotten 18 or 16. But we're in a place where, once again, we're looking at our defense obligations. We had the biggest pay increase for men and women in uniform in over a decade. All of those things matter. Senator McCaskill and I worked on one piece of legislation to allow the historic Delta Queen, which will be based at Kimmswick, Missouri, just south of St. Louis on the Mississippi River, to get back in operation again. That's a 1920s riverboat that not too many years ago, President Carter took his summer vacation on with the other passengers on that overnight facility. The Gateway Arch was reopened officially 60 years after the arch was built. It was time to restore the arch, but it was also time to connect the arch in better and different ways to the city of St. Louis. The historic courthouse where the Dred Scott decision was started. That's where the local federal court case was that wound up in a Supreme Court disaster in the minds of people looking back at how wrong-headed that particular court was. But that old courthouse still there, now connected as it wasn't before to the arch and downtown. It was really the first. I talked yesterday, Mr. President, to the designated person to run the Park Service, and I said, we want the second century of the Park Service to be a public-private partnership. There is no greater example of that than the reopening and the restoring of the arch, the connecting it to downtown. $300 and some million spent. Almost all of that money was either private or locally raised with a tax in the city of St. Louis. I think about 20 million of that $300+ million project was federal highway money. And the message there is, if you're going to expect a different source of money, you've also got to expect a different kind of partnership. I think one of the things the Park Service learned at that big project was the second century of the system, if it's going to be different, can't be just like the first century, except you get your money from somewhere else and then do whatever you want to do. What happens is you get your money from somewhere else and you have to create a sense that you really have partners in that. In St. Louis, during World War II and after, a lot of the work on atomic weapons was done in our state. Congresswoman Wagner and I were able in September to join a signing ceremony on a record of decision of what to do with some of that military waste, that radioactive waste left from the years before and after the end of World War II that had been discarded by the federal government in ways that weren't well thought out. Westlake, the Westlake landfill, families there have been tireless advocates of demanding that things be done for the health and safety of their children and their community. They waited for 27 years. There's some real criticism out there of Scott Pruitt, who was the EPA director. But when we first talked to him about this, he said, you can't be on the priority list for almost 30 years if it's really a priority list. And with his leadership and then the leadership of Administrator Wheeler, somehow we came to a conclusion there that has generally been met positively by people who've worked so hard to get that federal decision, and there's a public-private partnership, and the private companies they worked with to do something with this material, to now do the right thing with the material, which means moving it out of our state. In southeast Missouri, there was a port authority, an inland port authority, an almost $20 million bridge grant was announced the other day that allows that inland port with 2 new rail lines to become much more multimodal than it's been before. What's going to happen in world food demand, critically important. No country in the world is better suited than we are to meet the doubling of world food demand between now and 2050, the doubling of the biggest area of commerce on the world. But our inland ports in that discussion become particularly important. Both the Congress and in this case the Missouri General Assembly paying attention to the inland port structure like they haven't before. That is the biggest single piece of contiguous agricultural ground in the world is the Mississippi River Valley. And unlike the others in the world that may be almost as big, it has its own built-in transportation network. The Mississippi River, the Missouri, the Ohio, the Arkansas, the Illinois, the other rivers that flow into the Mississippi River create that network that now linked through the Panama Canal. Easily, you go to Asia. If you don't go through the Panama Canal, you easily get to either to the east coast of our country or you get to Europe and Africa. It is a great opportunity for us, and that kind of investment makes that opportunity more likely to pay the kind of dividends we would hope it would pay. In September of this year, Congress passed and the President signed the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill, which included $25 million for the Delta Regional Authority, an authority designed to benefit a part of our country where the early focus on labor-intensive occupations, particularly farming, has given way to a different kind of looking at that part of our economy without thinking about what happened to rural communities and the rural workforce is that moved on. Broadband is part of that, and I think we're going to see that continue to be a big part of what goes on in the future. But whether it's small ports, the Mississippi River and Tributaries Project, the St. Genevieve National Historic Park, the President signed that bill in March. St. Genevieve with French architecture that goes back to the late 1700s and the very early 1800s, unique in the kind of agriculture, of architecture that's preserved there. Some of the oldest buildings, certainly in the middle of the country and in some cases in the entire west of the Mississippi are there, and we're moving forward, I hope even yet this week, to do a couple of additional things that make that historic park work and be open to people from all over the world. The French ambassador wants to go there in the near future as an example of seeing what we're doing to maintain those buildings that are reflective of a different part of our heritage than we have in most of the country. Research institutions like the University of Missouri, the USDA Ag Research Facility in Columbia, and other places across our state have benefited from additional research money. In East Locust Creek, in August of 2018, it was announced that the final investment would be made for an East Locust Creek reservoir in north central Missouri. Water, a bigger and bigger challenge as we look toward the future, and thinking now about how we're going to have the kinds of water opportunities we need for drinking water, for agricultural water, and other water, very important. In Sedalia, Missouri, a project to help Senator Hartzler and Congresswoman Hartzler and I worked on a project to help make their industrial park work better. And Nucor just announced this year a significant and brand new steel facility in that part of our state. Kansas City, the Buck O'Neill Bridge across the Missouri River, something that has needed to be done for a long time. The community had come up with 90% of the money needed. A bridge grant that Secretary Chao called me about that the community had applied for gets that last 25 million of that 200 and some $1 million project. Whiteman Air Force Base in Warrensburg, a long fight to maintain the A-10 replacement, to maintain the A-10s and then do what we could to get the replacement wing there, important, as was the things that happened in St. Joseph with the lift capacity, the ability with those C-130s where 19 different countries come to that facility and train to figure out how to get the kind of support that we need for military all over the world, including our NATO allies. Senator Boozman and I, from the days we were in the House together, we formed the I-49 caucus. Another announcement just in the last month will allow the last few miles of I-49 to be completed in our state. I was there about 8 years ago when Highway 71 in Missouri became I-49 in most of our state. Now it's I-49. It will be I-49 in all of our states. So what's happened there? What's happened with opioid grant funding and with our mental health leadership in our state are all things that had significant legislative things happen this year. So Hire Vets Act was an act where not only hiring vets, but established recognition for that. Everybody says they hired vets, following up on legislation that was passed here in the Senate and in the House and signed into law in May of 2017. The Labor Department came up with that new standard of acknowledging who hires vets and who's better at hiring vets than anybody else. The first 5 Missouri employers were recognized this year, with dozens of employers all over the country in a tiered thing, Mr. President, sort of like the LEEDS standard for energy efficiency. We now have a standard for hiring vets. So whether it was the FAA reauthorization bill I mentioned earlier, our efforts to move toward more rural broadband that have moved significantly this year, but still that's one of the things that we need to be looking at next year. So, Mr. President, I would argue that this is one of the most effective, certainly one of the most effective right of center Congresses in a long time. And I think an effective Congress that looks at the issues facing the country, does the best we can to, in a long and short range way, deal with those issues. And it's something we ought to be talking to the people we work for about and trying to use that as a standard that next year we were good this year, let's figure out how to be even better next year.